Okay. How many of you, I want to start with a little question, how many of you have ever taken a gifts test? Do you know what a gifts test is? Okay, a couple of you. So you guys know what your gift is, right? Okay, well, I'm not going to beat you down about gifts today and whether or not you're using them. That's coming, though, so be prepared. Start thinking about taking the test so you can recognize your gift and use it. Today, I want to talk to you about compassion. And the reason I mention the gifts is because this week, in preparation for this, I took a gifts test, and I wasn't really surprised by the results. I've taken one in the past, and most of the things, my top 4 or 5 gifts are typically the same in one order or another, depending on which test you take. But I was reminded that I scored very high in the gift of mercy. And if you have the gift of mercy, you're someone who feels very strongly. You have a strong sense of empathy for people and the pain and the struggle that they go through. And you want to do something. And I mention that because that gift of mercy and our topic of compassion today work together. I think that the compassion fuels my gift of mercy, and the mercy fuels the compassion that I feel. But even if I didn't have the gift of mercy, and even if you don't, because not everyone does, you still are called to be compassionate, to have a heart of compassion. God calls all Christians to be compassionate. And that means all of us. Remember, we've talked many times about all. What is all? All is everything, everybody, all. We're all called to be compassionate. So even if you're not gifted, if you're not wired in that way, like some of us are, where compassion comes very easily to some people. Some people, compassion is really an act of obedience. God says be compassionate, and so I'm going to be compassionate. Either way, God calls us to show compassion to the people around us. Now, the word compassion or compassionate, something like that, is found nearly 100 times in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, in the Hebrew, in the Greek. And of course, we have our English definition, a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune, accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. And today we're going to talk about that, alleviating the suffering. We're going to learn, I hope, that compassion literally means to suffer with. I feel your pain. That's what we're talking about with compassion. It's a biblical concept. Compassion certainly is biblical, but it's not a Christian idea. I think we all know people who don't claim to be Christians, but they have very compassionate hearts, right? When we lived in Orlando, there's a lady there named Annie, and she felt many years ago a strong sense to feed the homeless. So every Sunday morning, she would come in before service and she would make them a big breakfast. Bacon and eggs or pancakes or French toast or something like that. She always made a big deal for them. Now, yes, she was a Christian. Annie had a friend who was not a Christian. Annie's friend and her husband were Muslims. But they heard about what Annie was doing to serve the homeless and to feed them and provide a hot meal for them. So they would come to this breakfast on Sunday morning with a big banana box full of food, eggs and cereals and things like that, and they would bring them to Annie to help her to support what she was doing to feed the homeless community. And sometimes they would stay and they would visit with some of the people, but they weren't Christians, but they had a compassionate heart. So it's not just a Christian idea, but it is definitely a biblical idea. Now, you've probably seen those commercials on TV with the poor little children with the tears and the flies around them, or the pitiful little puppy dogs and Sarah McLachlan playing in the background. Those commercials are meant to tug at your heart because the people behind those, the organizations that put those out, they're not, I think the Animal Rights is not a Christian organization, but they want you to be moved. They want to stir the compassion in you so that you will do something to help those children. You will do something to help those animals. That's their whole point, is to stir your compassion, whoever you are and whatever your faith base may be. So why is compassion important? Why is it important, especially for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus? Well, it's important to keep it in front of us, to talk about it, because even for those of us who are softies and feel very strongly, there's that, as we go through life, those things that happen that, well, our default nature is sin, right? When we get to the heart of it, all of us have that sin nature, and there's that tendency to fall back on that. And it's important because we have that, it's important to consider, to talk about, to teach about compassion, because we all have that self-centered gravitational pull, always pulling us back if we're not careful, if we're not focused on something else. No one had to teach our kids to be selfish, right? It's quite the opposite. We teach them to not be selfish. We teach them to share. We teach them to think about other people and consider other people's feelings. Nobody has to teach them to be selfish. It just happens. And because of our nature, if it goes unchecked, every one of us would just go right back to that self-centered, selfish place. So that's one reason compassion is important. A second is because needy people can make us uncomfortable, right? I mean, let's be honest. Needy people need people, and sometimes it makes us uncomfortable, especially for us Americans. We are self-reliant and independent, right? Now here's a hard one. Here's a heart check for you. Have you ever known someone who was going through a difficult time in their life? Maybe they've lost a loved one or some other very traumatic event in their life, and you think, just get over it. Move on. Okay? Nobody wants to admit that, so you don't have to raise your hand. But that's because we don't want to feel their pain anymore. And that's what compassion is. Compassion is suffering with them, feeling their pain. And that selfish nature of ours, we're okay for a little bit. We'll console you, we'll comfort you. But if you get down to the nitty-gritty of our selfish center, okay, that's enough. Move on. So that's the second reason. A third reason is because as we go through life, there's people who will make us jaded, right? I think if I did a survey, we would probably all raise our hands that there's been a time where you met someone, you heard their story, you felt for them, and you gave them some money or something to help them out. And then down the road, you see them again, and you realize, I've been had. I'm a sucker. That was all just a big scam. And those kind of things make us jaded. There's that tendency, if we allow it, to be hard-hearted. As I said, we spent 5 years in Orlando in a church that worked very closely with the homeless community. I saw it a lot. It happened to me. And I had to really focus to not become jaded. I had to pray about it and ask God to show me these people the way you see them. Because sometimes it was difficult. But I know that the Bible says to guard my heart, because the heart is the wellspring of life. And if I allowed my heart, if you allow your heart to become hardened, if you become jaded towards people, then what are you going to be able to do for them? Where is the compassion going to come from? You're not going to have it. It's just not going to be there. So today, we're going to check our heart. We're going to ask God to search us, to show us, and to change us. Because we want to be compassionate people, right? God is compassionate, and we are his people. And if we are trying to be like him, then we should also be compassionate. And we know that God is compassionate because the Bible is full of stories of his compassion. We know in the Exodus, God looked down and he saw his people. He saw the oppression and he saw the pain and the struggle that they were enduring. And he felt compassion and he made a way for them to have freedom. Now think about this, all the stories that you know of the Old Testament. And how many times did God move on behalf of his people? And how many times has he moved on behalf of you, whatever your circumstances may be? Because most of the time, the circumstances that the Israelites found themselves in, it was because of their own sin, because of their idolatry, because of their wickedness, because of their falling away from the Lord. And how many times do we also do that? But yet God has compassion. He sees our plight, and he is moved to act on our behalf. Jesus showed compassion. Jesus showed compassion, and when he healed and when he taught, he saw the people and he showed compassion to them, and he showed the ultimate act of compassion when he went to the cross to pay a debt that he knew that we could never pay. We could never do that for ourselves. And so in an act, the greatest act of compassion, he took that for us. So then, as God's people, we should be striving to be more like him, to be compassionate, which means that we must, not we should, we must have compassionate hearts. We must be compassionate people. So how do we do that? How do we be compassionate? Because I know for some people it's not something that comes naturally. So how do we do that? Well, today we're going to look at Psalm 82, verses 3 and 4. And I'm going to pull from there 4 ways that we can be compassionate, that we can show compassion. So Psalm 82, and I'm going to start in verse 3. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Okay, so for 4 different ways we're going to pull from Psalm 82 of how we can be compassionate toward other people. First of all, we can defend. The psalmist says, defend the weak and the fatherless. God is the defender of the fatherless and of the weak. And in biblical times, both the Old and the New Testament, the fatherless and the widows would have been the weakest, the most vulnerable, the most powerless of the people groups. And to some extent, they still are, especially the orphans. They have no voice, even today. The orphans need someone to defend them. And so we, as God's people, should be finding a way to defend the weak and the powerless. And I want to share a story that I just read. I guess it was this week. It's about Adam LaRoche. And I don't know if you've heard of him or not. He is a Major League Baseball player, or he was. He played for the Atlanta Braves. Played for a couple other teams. And most recently, he played for the Chicago White Sox. Well, last year, he left Major League Baseball for his own reasons that have nothing to do with this story. He chose to leave Major League Baseball. But when he did, he was introduced to someone along his path. He was introduced to someone who had started a group called the Exodus Road. And the Exodus Road is an anti-human trafficking group. They go in to rescue these children and women who have been taken into the human trafficking world. So he found out about this, and he got involved. And he went over with them to Southeast Asia. And he participated in what they called raid and rescue efforts. So basically, he and another man, I think was also a Major League Baseball player, a pitcher, they went over there and they went into these brothels in Southeast Asia, and they had a hidden camera, and they posed as someone who would be seeking the services of the girls there, and they recorded the whole thing up to the money transaction, because that's what they needed to have an arrest. And then they would leave, and they would take that evidence to the local police so that now they had something to go on, to go in there, to arrest the perpetrators, to liberate the women. So that's what he did in these brothels in Southeast Asia. And he said, and this is what to me was very powerful, you've got to understand that if you don't do it, then who is? These are boys and girls that have nobody fighting for them and never will unless one of these organizations steps in. There are, I don't know the numbers, thousands, maybe millions of children and women who, and maybe even young men who are pulled into the human trafficking world every day. And it happens here in Florida, in Tampa, in Orlando, in Jacksonville, in Miami, all those kind of places. It happens, and it happens to kids like Samantha. You don't realize what they're getting into. They're from a good home, and they make a mistake, and they talk to the wrong person, and they leave themselves vulnerable, and they're gone. It's a scary, scary thing. And he did something to defend those people, to help them, to pull them out of that world. Now, none of us in this room are likely to go over to Southeast Asia or some other place on the other side of the world to free sex slaves. I know that. But there's something that can be done here in our community. Maybe it's an anti-human trafficking thing, maybe it's something else. We're going to talk about a few other ways that we can do that, but there's something that we can do. Adam LaRoche was moved when he heard the stories, and so he did something to change it, to make a difference. The second thing that we can do, according to the Psalm, is to uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Now, there's a campaign for everything today, right? There's a pink ribbon for breast cancer, there's a purple ribbon for Alzheimer's, and these are good causes. I'm not knocking them. But the reason that they're so in our face is because the people behind them don't want them to be forgotten. They want their cause to be remembered. They want it in front of us all the time. That's why there's a walk and a candlelight vigil, and there's something for these causes all the time, because if they don't do that, it gets forgotten. It gets ignored. And little to nothing will be done to change that situation. What God is telling us is that one way for us to show compassion is to become an activist, to raise awareness for the poor, for the oppressed, for the defenseless and the vulnerable. Raising awareness, us doing that, that's an antidote to our selfish nature, because it confronts us. And when you're spending your time working and being compassionate to those who are vulnerable, when you're putting that in front of you, not just the commercials coming in, putting it in front of you, but you yourself are making the effort and you're putting it in front of you, well, you're going to spend a lot less time wallowing in your own mud and your own troubles, because you're focused out instead of in. And as Christians, that's what God calls us to do, is to focus outward, not inward. So the opposite of raising awareness is neglect, ignoring the situation. And it's really easy, as I said, it's really easy to get wrapped up in our own stuff, to forget about the weak and the vulnerable, because our problems are so big. And your problems may be big, I'm not denying that. But we can't always be focused in here. We have to look around us and we have to do something, because if we don't, who will? In one of my theology classes, I actually had a couple, and my professor said that people have asked him, why doesn't God do something about the hungry children and the sex slaves and all of that? Why doesn't God do something to stop that? If your God is so great, why doesn't he change that? And my professor's response was, he did. He sent you. Because God sent us to make a difference, to do something, to be the voice, right? And we have to remember that it's always possible that someday we could find ourselves in their place, whatever that may be. The third way, and the fourth, they're together. Rescue and deliver. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And now I mentioned Adam LaRoche and how he went to defend, but he also rescued and delivered while he was there. And that's one way we can show compassion to people, is to rescue and deliver. And I want to look at Luke chapter 10 for a moment. Jesus told a story about a man who had been beaten, robbed, stripped, and left for dead. You might be familiar with that story. Well, as this man lays on the side of the road. A priest goes by on the other side of the road, and then a Levite goes by, and he goes by on the other side of the road. And then a third man comes down the road. And this third man is a Samaritan. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him. Whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." When we think about the poor and their plight, it can be overwhelming. We can feel like there's not much to do, or not much that we can do. And the truth is that there's never going to be anything that we do to completely eradicate poverty. Jesus said that the poor would always be with us. So our response then is usually one of 2 extremes. We either want to do everything or we do nothing. And neither of those is what God is calling us to do. He doesn't expect us to do everything, but he certainly doesn't expect us to do nothing. There's somewhere in the middle. He wants you to do something. There's something that we can do to make a difference. And in this parable, we see an example of how we can be used by God to rescue and to deliver. In this story about the Samaritan man. And the first thing that we see that he did was he made the effort. Make the effort. That's what we do. There it goes. We need to make the effort. Now, it could be argued that both the priest and the Levite were justified in not stopping to help this man because they would have been ceremonially, it's hard to say, unclean. They would have been unclean. And then they wouldn't have been able to do their job, and they would have been separated from their family during this period of uncleanliness. So you could say that they had a good reason to not stop. But many of you might have heard Pastor Dennis, and he says that a reason is really just a dressed up excuse to make us feel better. So yes, they had a reason to not stop, but it wasn't a very good one because compassion always takes precedent over duty or any other thing. Because, the Samaritan man, I'm sure he had some things to do too. And he was a Samaritan. The Jews and the Samaritans did not like each other. They would go around their land to avoid them. The Jews would go around so they didn't have to go through and meet with the Samaritans. But here he stopped to help this man on his way. So he had good reason as well. But compassion trumps duty. Compassion trumps cultural differences, right? It's not always convenient for us to show love, to show compassion to other people. Sometimes it gets in the way of things that we have to do, things that we find important. Maybe our job, maybe our family. But compassion always trumps everything else. The second thing that he did, the Samaritan man did, he bandaged the wounds. He bandaged this man's wounds and helped him. There's nothing in this world that can hurt more than our words, right? We spew those nasty, vile, mean things at people, or maybe someone has done that to you and they hurt. And we can apologize, but you can't ever take those words back. They're out there. But in the same way, on the other side of the coin, sometimes words can heal as well. Because we don't know where people have been. We don't know how they got to where they are now. We don't know what's happened to them during the day, how they got to be there in that particular mood. And sometimes a kind word, a gentle voice, a smile is what they need to reset. It's what they need to have hope for people again. So we can bandage the wounds with our words. And number 3, I should have left it as a surprise, but you can give the money, right? That's what he did. He went to the inn, So, of course, he paid for that room there at the inn, and then he took care of this Jewish man. And then when he had to leave, he left money with the innkeeper, promising, if you spend more than this, I will give you more when I return. Okay? Sometimes we can just give the money. And again, God doesn't expect us to do everything. He's not asking you to do everything. He's asking you to do something. And surely there is something that stirs your heart as you go through life. Give to that. Do something about that. So now, our response and our commitment. How are we going to respond to this? How are we going to respond to be compassionate people, to defend, to uphold, to deliver, and to rescue? Well, the first thing you can do is ask God to give you a compassionate heart, right? Whether it comes easy to you or whether it does not come easy to you. You can pray and you can ask God to give you a heart of compassion. And let me just warn you that if you pray for a compassionate heart, you better mean it. Because if you pray in God's will, which this is, He wants us to be compassionate. If you pray for a compassionate heart, He's going to put somebody in front of you to show compassion to. So you better be ready for it. We can also stop ignoring it and pretending it doesn't happen. Don't ignore the oppressed and the abused and the poor, the homeless, the orphans and the widows. Don't ignore them. They're there. They need us. God sent us to make a difference in the world and to make a difference for the powerless and for the vulnerable. And y'all know my heart for the orphan. I can't watch those commercials with the little children or the dogs because I can't make it through. I'm a softie. But don't ignore it. Do something. And we can give. I talked about giving. Give to charities. And here I've listed some in our community, right here, that you can give to. We have the Samaritan Project. I don't know if you know about the Samaritan Project. They work to prevent homelessness. They help to keep people in their homes. They work to rehome those who have lost their home. And Dennis and I know personally the president, the director of the Samaritan Project, and I can tell you that she works very hard to do this. This is her heart. This is her mission. And I know that she works extra hard when she knows there are children involved to make sure that they have a place to lay their head. The Pregnancy Care Center here in Zephyrhills is another organization right here in our community, and they work to support families. They help them. They try to educate them and encourage them and support them. They offer classes on all kinds of different things, from healthy eating to how to balance a checkbook, Bible studies, providing baby needs, all kinds of things that they do right here in our community. There's Meals on Wheels, delivering meals, being a friendly face to someone who can't get out to get a meal or make their own. And Thomas Promise. Do you guys know about Thomas Promise? Thomas Promise was started by a little girl here in this community who had a friend who was going hungry at lunchtime, and she wanted to make a difference. And so last fall, I was in the office of the volunteer coordinator at West Zephyrhills Elementary School. And she had backpacks all over her office. And she told me that those backpacks were going to be filled with non-perishable goods so that the kids that were designated could take those backpacks home on Friday afternoon so that they had something to eat on Saturday and Sunday, because there's no breakfast and lunch served at the school. That's what Thomas Promise does to make sure that the kids in our community aren't going hungry. It's a great organization, and it was started by the idea and the heart of a child. There's always benevolence. There's always someone who is in need. And it doesn't have to be financial. You can give your time. You can give your presence, visiting at the rehabs and the nursing homes. Maybe you could read to someone who can't see the page anymore. Play cards, have a conversation. Sometimes people just want to be heard and feel like somebody cares. That's all they need. Maybe you could serve at the hospice, just serving the families, so they don't have to think about the details. You want some coffee? I'll get you some coffee. Whatever it is they do there, just do something to support the family, to be compassionate. Now, your gift may not be mercy, right? I know that. Not everyone has the gift of mercy, and compassion may not come easily to you. But as a follower of Jesus, you are called, we are all called to have a compassionate heart. So I'm going to ask you, how are you going to show compassion this week?